You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Daniel Pitt is a scholar and writer who lives in East Midlands, England, and is just about as English as you can get. Dr. Pitt studied at the University of Buckingham and University of Hull, and studied under and was personally mentored by the late, great Sir Roger Scruton. Pitt identifies himself as part of the proto-Burkean tradition of conservatism, which naturally makes him right at home here at Saving Elephants. I had a great time talking with Dr. Pitt, a conversation that he described as a splendid time recording a podcast with Josh that felt more like a chat down the pub than a podcast recording. I mean, I couldn't agree more, although I would say that was far more his doing than mine. We talked about the proto-conservatives and the tradition Burke was drawing on, Pitt's connection and experience working with Sir Roger Scruton, and so many nuggets along the way, I won't summarize them here. With all that, I give you my conversation with Daniel Pitt.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Daniel Pitt, it's great to have you back in the studio with us to have a conversation around conservatism, but I want to get this out of the way up front. Your mustache, for the benefit of the listener who's not seen you, you look somewhat like the villain in an American spaghetti western, or at least the dude playing the piano in the parlor room with this excellent curl at the tips there. So I had just wanted to get it out of the way. Are you asked about the mustache often? And I want to know, if you are you asked equally of men or women, and are the questions different?
Josh, thanks for having me on Saving Elephants. It's a podcast that I enjoy and listen to regularly, so I'm very pleased to be here. Yeah, the facial furniture or the facial fungus, depending on your view. I do. Some children ask me if I'm a chef because they think a chef has a moustache. I get asked by children if I'm French as well. And I said, no, it's a handlebar moustache. No, it's not French. Women normally ask me about how do I get it in the way that it is. Men, on the whole, they try and skirt around it. They're not so direct. I can see if they're trying to pick up tips, but they're not allowed to say in such a direct fashion. My children watch Teen Titans Go, and Robin, Batman's sidekick, talks. There's an episode about mustaches and beards, and he makes the argument that facial hair, especially mustaches, is about authority. And I'm more inclined that it's more about aesthetics rather than authority, or perhaps the aesthetic provides or the authority, but he juxtaposes it and said it's not about aesthetics, facial hair, it's about authority. And I disagree. So I stopped and paused the program and started talking to my children about how facial furniture is about aesthetics. They were not pleased.
That's awesome. That's an excellent segue, because now I'm curious. Did your pen say for aesthetics on facial furniture, let's call it, was that part of what led you to being interested in Roger Scruton, or did it work in reverse? Did Scruton awaken you to the beauty of aesthetics?
When I was about, I don't know, in my teenage years, I was very aware. I grew up on what we call a council estate in England, which is essentially owned by local government. So they're ugly buildings, and I could see the difference between the ones that were privately owned and occupied and the ones that were owned by the council. And I started to realize that the difference in beauty and how the effect it has on people, that the people who care about their area and the impact on the architecture. Winston Churchill said, we shape our buildings and then they shape us. And so I started to have that. And then I actually came to Scruton through his political writing. He was the Meaning of Conservatism was the second book I read on conservatism. Russell Kirk was my first one, Conservative Mind. That was the first ever book I had read on conservatism. Of course, I read other things about economics and business and social sciences, but actually a book on conservative thought. But I loved aesthetics, and so that's what attracted me to Roger. And one day I just emailed him, and I already had a master's degree at this point. And I emailed him. We started engaging in correspondence, and he said, "Oh, do you know I have this master's degree at University of Buckingham?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why don't you come and take it?" Well, I've already got one already, but the chance to be able to study with him was just a chance I couldn't turn down. So I went along, and I was a student for a year-long program. It was 12 months over the summer, and aesthetics was one of the core elements. But my interest has always been more on politics. He actually used to take the mickey out of me, saying that the most boring people are the people who discuss politics all the time.
I think in a world properly ordered, that's a true statement. I think our world is a little out of kilter, which it is now, when those discussing politics tend to be the most the drama queens, if you will.
Yes.
I would much prefer a world in which you and I are very boring. I'm a CPA, right? I do boring things for a living, and that's the way the world ought to be. But I'm trying to do my part to make it boring again. So let me ask you then about Sir Roger Scruton, because we don't have the benefit. He's one of the heroes or that I point to of trying to define conservatism. Although I think Matthew Continetti has it right, and this is throwing no shade at Roger Scruton, but from an American's perspective, you can understand a great deal about American conservatism without ever knowing about Roger Scruton.
Yes.
And yet at the same while, I think he added so much to our modern conversation of some of the things we're currently dealing with philosophically, politically. His untimely death, not that many years ago. I don't know that it's necessarily fair to say he had all that much to say commentary-wise over the let's say Trump phenomenon. In fact, I think he even said in one interview when he was asked, he preferred just not to discuss it.
Yes.
He preferred to discuss other things. But let me begin with a personal question, and maybe a little unfair, but I think it needs to be asked. You studied under Roger Scruton. You knew him quite well. Like, what was he like, just apart from the philosophy, the aesthetics, the politics? Who was Roger Scruton just as a person?
Well, his wife Sophie referred to Roger at one stage of his life as prickly, and he could be, but towards the end of his life, where I knew him more, he was much more softer in his demeanor. He was incredibly interested in you as a person. My wife fell pregnant for the first time with my daughter Primrose, and he was so happy about that. And we made a remark about, I said that two of the students have just had Fisher, you've been a guest of your podcast. We both had, wives pregnant at the same time. And he said something like, of course, this is what life is about. This is what conservatives understand. Life is about enjoyment. It's about enjoying life, being grateful for life. He was incredibly clever, witty, very witty, and he liked telling you about his rebellious past as well. That was one thing that he was telling us about. One thing was a little bit off-putting is that he would look at you out of the periphery of his eye. I don't know why that was, but he would stand and look at you that way because he was quite shy, surprisingly shy.
Huh.
He didn't come into a room and command it. He would stand in the corner, a glass of wine, and just talk. He wouldn't come in and take over the room, which I think shows his politeness really there, that in many ways. And I remember just standing outside outside a London pub and having a drink with him, and just thinking, wow, I'm standing with Roger Scruton talking about all this stuff, and people don't really know who he is, just the regular general people. And he was just a very witty, interested, and he wasn't pompous at all. There was none of that. And he was always surprised that other people were so interested in his work, which I always found interesting. That he actually at one stage he said, "You and not just me, but the fellow students, you know more about my work than I do." So he would take he was self-deprecating at times too.
It sounded like it was quite an honor getting a chance to know him that well. was.
Yeah, it was great, and then he was a mentor of mine. I went off to do my PhD at the University of Hull with Lord Norton of Louth, who's a Conservative peer, sits in the House of Lords, and an academic of and the greatest living constitutional specialist in our country. And I went off and did my PhD with him afterwards. But Roger stayed as a mentor after that, telling me where I should publish, who should I go and see, introducing me to people. So that was great. He was very, very grateful for that.
So this is maybe an odd segue to it, but I just happen to think to ask, since you brought that up, when you say the greatest living constitutional scholar, you're referring, I'm assuming, to the British Constitution.
Yeah, the British Constitution. Yeah.
Okay. Can you help for an ignorant American such as myself? Because when we talk about the Constitution, of course, we're talking about the document we wrote down. We can go pull it out, and this is one of Thomas Paine's, I think, main chief complaints against Edmund Burke's argument is, well, you know, the French and the British and the American Constitution, I can show them to you. Like, where is your British Constitution? So help from an ignorant American perspective, me understand, how does that work? From what I understand, an unwritten document, how does that, let's say, constitute a constitution?
Yeah. So the British Constitution is uncodified. Some people refer to it as unwritten, but there are written parts, and there are parts which are unwritten, which is just, Russell Kirk wrote about the American unwritten Constitution, the customs conventions, and so on. So America has the same as well. Like Blackrod. Blackrod is a person that at the state opening of Parliament, now the King goes to the House of Lords, delivers the what we refer to as the King's Speech, actually written by the government but delivered by the King in the House of Lords. And Blackrod goes, the King's there, the House of Lords are there, and Blackrod goes to the House of Commons, and he bangs on they slam the door in his face of the Commons, and he bangs on the door 3 times, and he summons the Commons to come to hear the speech. That signifies the supremacy of the House of Commons. So that's a ritual, so unwritten, but also constitutional element, a sort of an action, a symbol of the Constitution and the supremacy of the House of Commons. You can still, if you go and visit the House of Commons, you can actually see where Blackrod hits his rod, called Blackrod because he holds a black rod. You can see where he bangs on the door. It's actually, you can see the little chip in the door. And then on the one side, there's a big statue of Margaret Thatcher. You can go and see as well. And you actually see where the House of Commons was bombed during the Second World War. They've kept some of how it was, they haven't made it look pretty. You can still see where it was bombed and where the new chamber was built. So that's one element. But 4 main aspects of the Constitution: statute law. So you can actually go and see the 1911 Parliament Act, which is written down. Common law, which of course is both are the same in the United States. Works of authority. So you go back to A.V. Dicey, the Victorian scholar, see what he has written. So works of authority. And then convention. Actually, how does it work in practice? So you would go and read something like a book like Erskine May, which you now get online. Previously, you couldn't. But you actually see, how does it work in practice? So those are the 4 main sort of areas of the Constitution. Recently, there has been attempts by governments to try and put all of this in one place. They say that this isn't constitution making, but now you can go to a civil service document and you can read all of this in one place. So you can see that it's becoming more written, more in statute laws and so on. But there is not one document where you can go to and say, I've read the Constitution from cover to cover. You can't do that with the British one. You have to read statute laws. You have to read common law. You have to know the practice of what happens in the courts, in Parliament, in the executive. And you've got to read core works. Like I've already mentioned Dicey, but like Walter Bagot and these others. So you can spend a whole lifetime of reading it and still feel like there is so much more to learn.
And obviously, I think an American conservative could say something similar of the constitutional order here in the United States. Obviously, you can read the Constitution in an afternoon. It's not that long a document. But, getting into the Federalist Papers and what were the founders' actual arguments, and then where did they trace those arguments from all the way back to antiquity, you can spend an entire lifetime as well. I think it's fascinating, though, because I suspect some of the listeners might be thinking that sounds like the most pompous, unnecessary, archaic system I've ever heard of. And then some others might be thinking, yeah, that makes a lot of sense as far as a conservative idea of how things emerge over time, customs and traditions. And you mentioned Kirk, and you're right. As much as American conservatives venerate the Constitution, and I think rightly so, would argue that it's the customs and mores and norms and traditions that underpin it, that give it its actual life and vitality. It's not just the dead written words themselves. Or maybe to put it a different way, those words have little vitality and meaning unless it's backed up by another, by some sort of norms that have developed over time. I am blanking on, I think it was either Daniel Webster or I cannot remember the individual, said essentially the American Constitution is not for export. Yeah. It's not a document we can just give to some other people group and somehow it's going to go well with them. It had to be mapped onto a culture.
That was exactly what I was about to say, which was interesting, that this culture of constitutionalism that needs to run underneath it. You can pick up a skeleton and you could put it somewhere, but it's the muscles, it's the bones, it's the muscle memory of how it actually works in practice. Taking a document and then exporting it. Many Southern American countries have tried it, and got Mexico, for example, and it's gone belly up, and they wonder why. Why has it not worked? It's because it doesn't have the culture, the norms, the muscle memory, things like we discussed in Britain after Brexit about just losers' consent, that transition of power. That when you lose, are you willing to say, yes, I lost, and hand over power?
Yeah,
that's actually that's built up over time to allow that to happen, that muscle memory and that willingness to do so.
It is something that, as a conservative, I take very seriously. The events of, say, like January 6th, the incursion on the U.S. Capitol is extremely serious because, God forbid we ever have anything like that happen again. And one of the ways I think you can partially avoid a scenario like that is if from this point onward we had, say, presidential elections that were so decisive, the losing party was like, okay, I get it, we lost. We lost 40 of the 50 states, kind of thing, in the presidential election.
Mm-hmm.
But we now live in a world in which it's an open question. Could a losing candidate question the validity of the election? And does that mean a pretty sizable minority of Americans believe that? This is not completely unique in U.S. history. Of course, this happened when George W. Bush, Al Gore, there was an open question among the Democrats. Was that a stolen election? Mm-hmm. Some of that, I think, is always there in a democracy, but I think it is. I think necessary we jealously guard a culture that cedes power when one side is lost and not just question the entire system. Because I think once you open that Pandora's box, putting it back together can be extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I absolutely agree. Yeah. I always find it's interesting that looking back in history, and then you can apply it to current events. I find it fascinating that you need to deep dive into the past to be able to understand the present and understand going forward as well.
So I'm curious because I know that I've heard you speak before about, and maybe this is my term, proto-conservative. I kind of map my conservatism as beginning with Burke. I don't mean by that there weren't great conservative thinkers or illuminators or people that had good things to say, because Burke is drawing from a tradition that praise him. But I kind of think of Burke as a. Are we having video audio issues? It looks like the camera keeps going out.
Yeah.
So long as you can hear me, okay. I guess
I can hear you.
Okay. That Burke obviously is operating from an older tradition. I mean, I think he very clearly would say he's not inventing something whole cloth. Mm-hmm. That being said, as a let's say not an American, let's say as a Westerner, I think a lot of our politics is understood as the argument we've never resolved between the French and British ideas of liberty.
Yes.
Broadly speaking, it goes beyond just France and Great Britain, but sort of the French Revolution and the response to the French Revolution. And Burke, I think, is the, in my view, central figure to try to understand one side of that argument. So that being said, like I would assume you would have a similar disposition towards Burke, but I'm just curious if you do. Who are these proto-conservatives that Burke himself is maybe drawing from that might form the building blocks of, say, a Burkean conservative thought?
Yeah. Well, Burke, first of all, didn't see himself as creating anything new. He was articulating a tradition that was already in existence. And so if you read his work, he's drawing on other inspirations and so on. You've got people who you can look back. You could say William Blackstone, who is also well read in America. You've got Richard Hooker, who's very, very keen on religion and this sort of thing. I'm not saying that he's Burkean at all, but Thomas Hobbes has some things to teach conservatives, some things not to teach conservatives,
right,
as well. You've got others. You could go back even. There's David Hume, who you could say also. I always, one academic at my university, when I always go back to Burke and start with Burke, he always asked me the question, why not Hume? Why don't you go with David Hume? So Hume's one that you could go to. You could go all the way back to Aristotle, for example. He has conservative, you could call him a proto-conservative, perhaps. So John Selden is someone who gets remarked upon lately as well. John Fortescue. So there are all of these people in this long tradition that Burke was sort of discussing, involved in that vat of tradition. Also, there are others who were not more Tory. So Burke was a Whig, but Whigs were not one. They weren't monolithic at all.
He even has a speech about from the old to the new Whigs or something to that effect.
Exactly. So he referred to himself as an old Whig, and there were these new Whigs that had different views. They started to change. Burke was extremely chastised with his reflections from many liberals. They were very angry at him to say that he didn't understand the French liberty and he was mistaken. Of course, he wasn't. He was very much proved correct. People like the Romantics detached themselves because of Burke away from the egalitarians, who had, like William Wordsworth and so on, who were very much in favor at the beginning of the revolution and then became more conservative because of Burke. But you can also class Whigs in a sort of proto-liberal type and proto-conservative types, like small c conservative Whigs. And you can see that when the Conservative and Liberal parties went from being Tories and Whigs, you could see where they went. Quite a few crossed over. William Gladstone, the great Liberal Prime Minister, was actually a Conservative, was a Tory, and then he moved over to the Liberal Party. You have Earl Derby, 14th Derby, he was a Whig and then became a Tory. So you can see when the Whigs were starting to fracture, you can see their more ideological inclinations of where they moved into each party. There was a bit like a shaking of the snow globe, and people started to move parties around that time. So the Whigs were not monolithic in their views. Winston Churchill, in his book, I think it might be the English-speaking peoples, he has a chapter on Burke, the conservative, or Burke on authority and Burke on liberty. And conservatives normally hyphenate it, ordered liberty, or they use that phrase, ordered liberty, that conservatives are not fully for order, like an authoritarian, because you need to have, Russell Kirk would say, you need justice and freedom in that order, justice, freedom. And then conservatives who are more freedom loving also understand that you need order as well. They are not anarchists or anarcho-capitalism. So that was something where these two Tory and Whig traditions have influenced each other. And you can normally see conservatives in practice. And this is, for me, something very important of conservative statesmanship, is to know when you need to dwell on order, when things have gone too far, there's anarchy, and you need to move towards order. And you know when it's the opposite, you're becoming oscillated, stuck, rigid, you need to free things up. So you could have quite the same conservative statesman saying at one stage we need policies for order, and then the same that 2 years later we need policies for freedom. Or like in the Reagan and Thatcher era, the emphasis was put on freedom,
Right.
because the economies of the 70s were a disaster and they needed reforming towards freeing up.
This, of course, is partially why Burke is often accused of being inconsistent or a hypocrite, that at times it looks like he's focused on one over the other and then he switches or something like that. But I think it's, as a Burkean, I think that an understanding of his career as a whole is very consistent. It's just he's kind of the counterbalance in the moment he's at. But I'm curious again from...
And Burke was a statesman, an active politician. He was not sat in a study reading. And I like this quote for me I like this one. It's like you got all this education, all this thinking. It's like putting a boat together and keeping it in dock and then letting it out to sea. Burke went out to sea.
Right.
And when you're going out to sea, as much of this a priori theoretical knowledge is you got to actually look at what the waves are doing, how the wind's blowing. You've got to see and keep that ship of state sailing.
Yeah, and I think if there's one thing we can't accuse Burke of, it's him being a purely abstract theorist.
Absolutely not.
Right, he abhorred the idea. But it made me think. I had a guest on a while back, Hans Eichholz, who introduced me kind of this, I guess what he would call the sentiments in the United States at the time of the founding, at the time of the Revolutionary War. I recognize I'm speaking to a good member of the British society, so I'm going to be careful how I transgress here. But I'm curious because you would have, I think, a greater capacity to appreciate this idea or argument. What Hans was arguing was that part of what was happening in the United States was essentially an argument that had spilled over from Great Britain among the Whigs in this idea of where exactly do these natural... Who is the secure or guarantor, if you will, of these liberties? And that there were voices in the broader Whigs that saw Parliament or elevated Parliament at a greater degree than others. In other words, they essentially saw, look, Parliament is that which is which is securing our rights as British citizens from an otherwise tyrannical crown, say, or a central state, or maybe a tyrannical church, right? Parliament is our essential voice of the people to defend ourselves from other tyrannies. Whereas another voice of the Whigs was saying, no, Parliament is a tool, a mechanism, of course, and they're important, but they too could be tyrannical. There's nothing that says that just because we've elected some of these people, that somehow makes them, incapable, that somehow they're the magical voice of the people in all things, if you will. And so maybe this is a ham-fisted way of setting up the question, but I'm just curious, is that because obviously the latter view is the one that the American founders would have taken more? Why do we owe some allegiance to Parliament if they're usurping our understanding of our rights as subject of Great Britain? Is that an argument that makes sense from a British perspective? Is that part of what was going on among the Whigs at this time, or how would you read that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I would say the arguments in America are very much extensions of the Tory and Whig and fractions within Whig debates. You can see many Anglicans in America, Tories in the American sense, who were loyal to the crown. They give the same arguments of Tories are doing over the Atlantic. And you've got Thomas Paine, of course, who we previously mentioned. You've got John Locke, the famous Whig. Their arguments are picked up and brought over, and it's the same debates. The Civil War in the 1600s in Britain is literally between the royalists, the monarchy, and Parliament, You can go back and you can read almost word for word the same arguments. I did a podcast very recently with National Review Institute on Churchill, and I was doing a bit of research on that. And Churchill argued that the Declaration of Independence was in the great line of Whig documents. It was within the Whig tradition, and it was one of the height of Whiggery, Whig thought. And he puts it within it. Of course, he was a great lover of America. His mother was American, and he put it directly into that Whig tradition. And I thought that was fascinating. And that he was arguing back in 1950s, 60s. He's still arguing that this was not a deviation. This was not a repudiation of English traditional political thought. It's actually just a part of it, a Whig part of it.
That's interesting because even in the United States, among the founders, there was arguments oftentimes of, is this a continuation of the British tradition? I mean, the more Adams or Hamiltonian version, I think, was more comfortable with the British, whereas, and it's ironic to say Jefferson because he wrote the freaking Declaration, but he was so much more a Francophile. And certainly when we're talking about Thomas Paine, I mean, and I'm sure he recognized to a certain degree he was echoing British Whig old tradition. But he too, I mean, he took Jefferson's Francophile and just, here, hold my beer. Let me run even further with this. And so because it's sort of an argument, I think, in the United States, were we doing something new, or were we just, I think the Adams version is like, no, it's not a revolution. This is a reformation back to these older ideas. Although we have with us, the Revolutionary War as the terminology is used, but I think it's a revolution in a small r sense of the word, not in a French Revolution or certainly Russian Revolution sense of the word.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm much more with Adams on those things. My view, I think Adams is reading his work on the Constitution. I think it's one of the best written pieces of work by an American on constitutions. Very persuasive. I think Adams was pretty much right on most things. When I go over to America, people normally ask me who's my favorite founding father, which I always find an odd question, but I always go with Adams, and then they look at me and are you sure? I said, yeah, definitely. Yeah,
who do they think you should pick?
I don't know. I tried to move the conversation on to Nesbitt or Kirk or something like that instead.
Well, maybe you could pick Dickinson or somebody who was pro sentiment of the revolution, but didn't think it was wise to fight a war with Great Britain. And I always think back of Jim Gaffigan, an American comedian, talks about the difference between the founding views. You have your Washington and your Jefferson, very, very egalitarian, very proper, writing these things about natural rights. And then you have the dudes in Boston. They're like, yeah, we heard what you said about liberty and independence. We liked it. So we just went and started a war with the greatest, military power on earth.
Remark about revolution, though, that word has changed in meaning. Then when we say revolution now, we have this Marxist idea of that, the idea of two distinct groups, the bourgeoisie, proletariat, conflicting against one another, and it leads to a forward motion. Revolution is a forward motion of the great leap forward. But actually, revolution in its more Lockean form is actually a turning back. A revolution is a turning back. It's a restoration to old things that you've gone wrong somewhere. So I think that's an interest. I always make sure that when we talk about we need a revolution, it's like, okay, what sort of term are we using? Are we using the Marxist or the more Lockean term of revolution? And I think that makes it much more easier to understand why someone like Burke could have a different view of the French and then the American Revolution, because you've got two different forms of revolution there, and you can know that just by the meaning of the word. Okay, you can have at least two different meanings of that word revolution. So it's not a contradiction. You can be in favor of the one, the turning back, the Lockean, and not be in favor of the other one, the Marxist turning forward. So it's not a contradiction at all.
No, I appreciate you saying that. And of course, the Marxist revolutions that come later in history, I think, highlight the difference in a manner that's almost impossible to ignore. The ones that were taking place in Burke's day was the American and the French revolutions, which the American comes first and then the French. And you have, again, although Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, it's the same thing. Like, this is all, we're equal, it's brotherhood for liberty. It's the exact same revolution. It's just being fought in two different continents. Whereas you have other things like Burke, no, it's not the same. One is an attempt of restoration of understanding of rights. The other is just trying to, well, let me put it this way. I think part of the central argument here is the degree to which we don't agree on to what degree do we humans have the capacity to tear apart old structures and just reinvent something whole cloth? Like how malleable is the human species? How changeable, how perfectible is humanity? Whereas I think my understanding of the Burkean notion is that, I won't call it perfection, but let's say progress, lower P progress, comes about through the messiness of the world we're born into. Of all the traditions we're born into. We might not understand the traditions, but we need to assume, we need to have a prejudice, to put it in a Burkean term, that what came before us was probably fought over and possibly for good reason. Doesn't mean we have to accept it. We could go explore it and find out it was the wrong thing to do. But that we ought not to just assume that if we just took away all our traditions, say, we could build something lasting and durable, even better. In fact, Burke, I think at one point in the revolution in France, was talking to the French saying, look, if you were unsatisfied with your current regime, why not go back to some prior period? Why not look at some heroes in a past age that were French that you could draw on? Like, why start something new?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult to start anything new in human society. We are born into a web of traditions and customs and relationships. That we have relationships as soon as we are born, actually even before we are born, to be quite honest. That I've got 4 children, and I spoke to all of them through my wife's belly. They can hear us. We know that, scientifically proven. So my relationship with my children started before they were born. So they are born into this tangled web of customs and laws. They are born in a country. They are born in a hospital. There are conventions. There's hierarchies. Midwives and doctors, grandparents, expectations. The idea, of course, Rousseau said that these were all chains wrapped around us. They're not chains; they're the things that can make us flourish. And then that's the wrong premise straight away. So you think, right, these are all chains. We can throw off the chains because we are born free, which we're not. We are born incredibly. We can't do anything for ourselves. That's one thing that when you're raising a newborn baby, is a newborn baby can't do anything. And I'm teaching my other children. They're asking, why can't Marigold speak? Why can't she go to the loo? Why can't she play with me yet? We have to teach her from scratch. It's hard work. It's not free just to allow her to grow up unaided. If you throw off those chains, what are you going to get? You're going to get nothing. It's incredibly difficult to build. It's so difficult to build. Innovation is only, like T.S. Eliot would argue, is because you have a tradition in the first place.
Right.
That he changed the tradition. He was a modernist, but he knew that he had a tradition and he was drawing on that tradition. Even if you are rejecting a tradition, you are within a tradition. Otherwise, it's just meaningless. If you hear a jazz player going off on their own little solo, and you didn't have the melody and all the rest of it to go with it, it would just sound horrendous, because you need that to be able to then go off and do something else.
This is something I talk about often, because I think it's needful to say that there is a form of small c conservatism that I stand against. That is a get off my lawn conservatism. It's an inability to build off of tradition. It's a stuck in the past. It's an attempt to turn the clocks back to a time that never existed, but is presumed to be sort of a utopia. And I think it is the conservative mindset, such as T.S. Eliot, that the true, let's call them innovators, the true creatives, the true people that have something of value and durability to say in this world, do it building off a tradition. They're not stuck in tradition, but they recognize it as a platform to build on, not something to be destroyed as if it's sort of something preventing true innovation.
Tradition has to be living and breathing. And remember, tradition is, I think that like Hayek says this, and Scruton argues this, that not tradition is epistemic. It's got knowledge in it. It tells us how to live our lives. It has knowledge in it, and we want to build on that knowledge. We keep learning. Just raising children, I've learned about parenthood, fatherhood through each different child, but I'm still using the tradition that helped me, but I'm building on it, and we build on it, and we build on it. And that's the true way of having proper progress, like small c progress, and understanding and developing our understanding. But that's not, I think C.S. Lewis had the phrase something like anthropological snobbery, that you can, you can go back,
that phrase.
and you can go back and you go, everything we knew before is nonsense because we are far superior now. But also, I've always argued we have some conservatives, which I think is mistaken. It's not really properly conservative. Is that the opposite way around? That you have it, that everything in the past was great and everything in the present is awful, which of course is not correct. That's not true. There are many things in the past that we wouldn't want to do now in many different ways. But there are things in the past that we can learn from as well. So I think that's the sieving, the trial and error, as you would say, the sieving of the knowledge that's in tradition and reshaping it and reforming it for our time. That's what the tradition is meant to be there for, is how to live. How can we live together? How can I live with my wife and my children and my neighbor? And like the little platoons, as Bert called them, don't stop. He says they grow, and all the way out to humanity, he said. But we need to find ways of living together, and tradition is a really good way. I had a left-wing friend who always says that she is difficult at understanding social conventions. And I said, that's because we stripped them away. We said they're useless. You don't need to say, how do you do? You don't need to say good morning or good evening. They're stripped away. Well, the reason why they're there is because it gives you a moment to pause and to understand and think about what you're going to say. I don't need like habit. I just say good morning. If I have to start from scratch, from first principles, from reason about what am I going to say to you every single time I see you, we'll stop talking. And you see that in many societies, that just passing someone down the street, you just say good morning, hello. Those then move out, wash away. The knowledge has been lost, and we are then just bare, shivering, naked individuals trying to come up from first principles about how do we deal with each other again.
No, it is something that sometimes I wonder how much of this is innate within us, these worldview differences, because people can gravitate toward, broadly speaking, conservative or let's say progressive ideologies. I think they just kind of feel these things to be true. There's conservatives, I think, are built with kind of a natural suspicion of the power of the collective state to do good. That oftentimes a progressive is just, it has to be taught or it has to be demonstrated sometimes. And I'm wondering, because I love that phrase at C.S. Lewis, chronological snobbery. I think that captures an idea very well. Just because we run the, why are we so snobbish about the people in the past? Now, if I remember correctly, I don't remember if Lewis said this. If he did, it may have been someone else who added to it. Did acknowledge that, yes, there can be progression in certain realms of reality. For instance, technology, the sciences. We can see things that, okay, it's things that seem so barbaric to us today, the way they handle things medically, especially. Although I would argue there's still a lot of ways in which I don't know we've really advanced that much medically. But there is a sense of progress within certain realms of humans' existence. The problem is when we try to therefore assume we can pull these into other things. Morality, for instance. We don't, the human nature itself is not something that, in my view, progresses. I don't think we're somehow a better species today than we were 100 years ago. And of course, around the Enlightenment era gave birth to the eventually the notion of the political science. Like, we've seen all these improvements in the natural world. Could we not just apply these same thinking to politics, to how we organize society? And I don't know how much of the left today necessarily takes it as serious as they did say 100 years ago. But it does seem to be sort of an unspoken embedded idea that somehow progress is a capital P. It is something we're literally moving toward, to the point that society and the state has a goal, an endpoint, a purpose, if you will, that I think the conservative just naturally does not see it that way.
No, I think that stems right back from normally when I know that you shouldn't talk about politics in polite society, and I'm quite awkward at doing so, even though it's my job and I come on these podcasts and so on. But when it's especially in these arenas, so I normally just say, if they say, "Oh, right, Dan, you're a conservative, I'm not," and they want to discuss personalities, for example, or particular policies, I normally go, right, let's go back to what I think are the key main points of politics, where we get our politics from. Human nature, what's human anthropology, what's knowledge, where do we get our knowledge from, and what's the universe like, what ontology. That normally those three things close the conversation down pretty quickly, and they don't want to talk about politics with me anymore, which is great. But the human understanding of that is the human being malleable. Can we make the human being better? That can we do this through science or developing a better morality? Conservatives have always said no, that's not the case. Human nature is fixed. I'm always quite a lot of David Hume's quote about the human nature has the dove and the serpent in them. It has the good and the bad. You can see great human goodness, people doing incredible things, great stuff for charity, and you can see the most depraved stuff that human beings do to human beings. And conservatives that take that and they say, yes, that is going to happen in the world. Sometimes the left and liberals criticize conservatives because they say, we accept that. Well, if you accept it, it's never going to go. Well, right. Conservatives say, no, it's always going to be there and you need to look out for it. That's why you need laws and order. You need punishment. You need deterrence. You need economic incentives to push people towards the good and away from the bad, and these sort of things. And that's a way sometimes conservatives can argue that you've got too much liberty and not enough virtue, because we always have in the back of our mind that if you've got too much liberty to do bad, that's not a good thing. So that is human nature is a key one. And then our understanding of knowledge, epistemology, that we have a skeptical approach to knowledge in the sense that human beings are never going to have perfect knowledge. Never. That's not going to happen. We are always going to be catching glimpses of the world. We'll know more perhaps through research as we move forward. We know a bit more about things. Some topic areas, such as medicine, are more inclined to that development than others, like perhaps religion, theology, philosophy. They even try to put the scientific approach into philosophy, which doesn't work at all. And so they tried to take liberals and leftists and so on, and they tried to take this idea of that if I can quantify something, if I can get the causal relationship, if I can take the scientific approach, actually that woke are starting to deny all this stuff, and you add it to social problems, the economy, social problems, all we need to do is take the horrible social bits, those chains again, away, and the human person will flourish, because they believe, I know this is broad and there are many different views, but the individual is ultimately good. It's society that has the negative impact. Yeah. There's no innate badness in human beings. It's just the environment having negative effect. So you can throw off tradition, you can throw off just horrible capitalism, you can throw off free markets, you can throw off racism and throw off sexism, and we can all identify how we wish, and human being will be good. We'll never have to worry. We can go fishing, we can do our painting, we can look after our stock, because human being is good. And conservatives will always say that was always wrong, because those traditions, that free market, like Margaret Thatcher thought that a free market is a way of creating virtue, that virtuous person, self-determination, self-help, self-striving, always striving for better. It was a moral argument or around why you should have free and markets and enterprise.
Yeah, there's a number of world leaders that have thought war creates virtues, right? Of certain courage and heroism, and to be fair, it does. It's just it creates more than just virtue. It can also create vices if one's not careful. I think it's, I don't want to stray too far from the topic because it occurred to me you had mentioned this earlier when we were talking about bringing up your children. I think it would be good if we return to that. I think I've heard you talk about this. Unchosen obligations, and this is something that Scruton really drills down on.
Yeah,
because I think it is something that is, we've not discussed, let's say, libertarian ideology. It's not really of the left, but it chafes against that conservative impulse. Say it can be a little bit more Rousseauian, a little bit more. Let's just throw the chains off and all will be well. So let's unpackage that just a little bit more. I understand it's a little scary sometimes for a person to hear about all these unchosen obligations because you can take that too far. You can go Hobbesian route, right? You have absolute allegiance to an authoritarian state because you didn't choose that obligation. So what is the mitigating grounds, say, that allows for liberty to flourish, yet recognizes that we come into this world, we didn't consent to everything. We didn't consent to the country we were born in. We didn't consent to the family we're born into. We're just here. And because we're just here, it implies that we have obligations that we didn't freely choose.
Yeah, this is so important topic. It was actually the topic area that Roger and I were most drawn to each other about because interested in piety, interested in unchosen obligations. And this is one of the reasons that when I liberalism is one of my interests as well. I find it fascinating. I think liberalism, classical liberalism, Rawlsian liberalism, all of these different liberalisms, I find it fascinating. It's a fascinating worldview. But one thing that I've always found that I couldn't live my life by it is that it was too thin, that I was looking around and thinking all of the things that I hold most dear, I didn't choose. As you've already outlined, my family, my country, and my sex. I didn't choose to be a male. I didn't choose these things, and that's one of the things that the trans ideology is trying to underpin. Is this idea putting choice in the area where it's not? Conservatives will say there is no choice there. It just can't be. It's unchosen. So this is fascinating. We are born into a web of obligations that we didn't choose. Liberalism in its form says that actually freedom is when we choose. We have to choose these. We need to opt into these. And then you've got philosophical anarchists like Martin Wolf, who says then, therefore, the modern society and the modern state is therefore illegitimate. We need to have something closer to anarchy. And I don't mean anarchy as in, throwing bombs on the street. I just mean no government. Anarchy as in just self-rule completely, that you opt into all of these things. And Hayek, Burke, many of these liberals or classical liberals that are pro-market, they've all argued that for the market to work, you have to have these obligations wrapped around it. Customs, traditions that hold it in place, law. Then when we say free market, we normally mean no government regulation or something like that. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean no law. It doesn't mean no customs, because actually those things actually build the flourishing. Because if I promise to sell you something, so promise giving, as Hume would argue, is a convention, and it makes the free market work. Without this convention of promise giving, the market wouldn't work, because I promise, you contract, we contract with each other. We both have this idea of obligation to the contract. So you need something wider than just the contract to hold it together. Think about going on the road. You would say, right, lots of people, and especially in the United States, have this view that when you get your first car and you can go and drive, it's great freedom, brilliant freedom, Russell Kirk didn't have this view, did he? Of course.
Right. Didn't he hate the automobile?
He hated it. He thought it was a what was it? Something Jacobean, mechanical Jacobean. That was it. It was a revolutionary.
I don't share that view, but I see where he's coming from.
So it gives you freedom, and it can give you great freedom, but you only have freedom because there are rules and laws of the road. Which side of the road do you drive on? Let's not get into that debate. But but the when you give way, when do you stop? What does red light mean? What does green light? What does the roundabout or the whatever these things, the lines on the road, the speed limits, all of these things give you and create freedom. This is what all of those unchosen obligations do. They actually provide you the meaning and the freedom to do the things that you need to do. Not stripping them away. It's not. It's the building on them. They are the groundwork to provide you the freedom. Just like in the car, you get ultimate freedom getting that car, go out and travel. But that's because there are rules, conventions, and laws regarding how you drive. Just think, take away which side of the road you drive on, and you go around a corner and you didn't know for certain if that other person was going to be on the other side of the road coming the other way.
Yeah.
Your freedom would be highly diminished, if not taken away completely. If everyone tried to drive at the same time, there's no red light or green light, when you can go or not go, when you give way, there would be utter chaos and anarchy. It would dissolve. So I think that is the way that conservatives think of freedom, that you have, these are things, not these, to say it as like rail guards, they allow you to be free.
Yeah. I appreciate all the imagery. That's very helpful. I hope this conversation hasn't suffered from my hosting duties failing to put up enough rail guards around what the heck are we talking about, because it's been a little meandering, but it's all been good.
Well,
sometimes these are my favorite conversations. But I want to give you an opportunity.
It's very conservative in that there's been no plan. We've had a plan, no plan, Oakeshottian, and we've allowed the conversation to flow person to person.
There you go. Okay, we'll call it a ordered liberty, right? We've got some guardrails, but we've kind of allowed to flourish within the.
Exactly. There you go.
Let me close then, because it occurred to me you might be this may be something you could enlighten us on. If you're someone listening to this conversation, you mentioned the first book you'd read on conservatism was The Conservative Mind, and depending on the individual, I don't know if I would recommend that. That's a dense book. As I was reading through, I remember it was one of the first ones I read, and I kept thinking things like, I need to learn more about the British corn laws because I don't know what the heck Kirk is talking about. Like, he just assumes I know this stuff.
Yeah, it's not an easy first in.
It's not an easy first in. So I'm wondering which ones would be, if you had here are the three, if someone's listening, good, I suppose if they made it to this part in the conversation and they really want an introduction to conservatism, God help them, because we kind of been on the deep end, but what are some good introductory texts? And let's say some intermediate too. Let me put it ask a question both ways. Good introductory text, but also what are those key books? Like, would you consider Reflections on the Revolution, The Conservative Mind? What are the ones that if you really want to know conservatism, you actually have to read these?
You have to read books, The Reflections on the Revolution in France. You've got to do that. It's tough reading, and it's not systematic at all. So it's another one of those difficult ones. You've got to read, as far as I'm concerned, Roger Scruton. You've just got to. I think one of the easiest ones for him is The Invitation to a Tradition, one of his latest ones. And especially for an American audience, that there's more American stuff in there than usual in his other writing. That's also a good one. Anything by Richard Weaver's great, an American. Richard Weaver's brilliant. Ideas of Consequences. You got to read that. Robert Nesbitt's work. That I would definitely go with those. British one, Anthony O'Hare, who's also he's also taught me, along with Scruton. I would say he's the biggest conservative philosopher at the moment. He's sort of in his late 80s. He's got loads of great work. Definitely go to him. These are the main ones to go to. And you notice that I would say that these are mostly written in the 50s and 60s. I would always start there with American conservatism because it's where it flourished. That's always the main to go with American conservatism. With British conservatism, I've already mentioned Burke, David Hume. Try and read something of Adam Smith if you can. This is one thing about at this point that conservatives can take a lot from liberal thought. Not everything, but they can take a lot from liberal thought as well. These are great books to go to.
Excellent suggestion. As you can see behind me, I like books. I'm happy to say I've read many of those authors, although I'm not familiar with that. Who was the British
Anthony O'Hare?
I'm not familiar with him. I'll have to check that out.
I put a post out on X, as we call it now, recently about he's probably the best conservative philosopher you've probably not heard of. He's great. He's got loads of good stuff, and he wrote for Roger Scruton's magazine, the Salisbury Review, for years. Yeah, I don't think he's well known in America though. I don't think he'd be well known for young conservatives either.
Okay. Well, interesting. Well, I'll have to check that out because, I had not heard that name before, or at least if I had, I'd forgotten. But Daniel, I want to thank you for the wonderful meandering conversation. I knew it would be great. We've had a chance to meet before this, and I knew we'd have a good talk, but I definitely appreciate it. Glad we were able to get this done. Daniel Pitt, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the Saving Elephant Show.
My pleasure. I'm pleased to be on.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.